Now, one fellow who did address this issue in 1997, who has tremendous credibility in the world, still, I think, is Alan Greenspan when he was chairman of the Board of Governors. Go to the next slide, please. And I wrote a little book about the talk that he gave in Belgium. It wasn't covered on this side of the ocean. And essentially, Mr. Greenspan raised issues that nobody had ever raised before. This book, by the way, is a free download off the FAME website. If you don't want to print it out, it's $12 and change from Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com. Go to the next slide, please. And here's some of the stuff that Mr. Greenspan said that's relevant for today. In his words, he said, if central banks effectively insulate private institutions, we're talking about banks, but now we're talking about Bear Stearns and others, from the largest potential losses, however incurred, increased laxity could threaten a major drain on taxpayers. A major drain on taxpayers, he's talking about a loss of your savings, a loss of your annuities, a loss of your pension, or produce inflationary instability as a consequence of excess money creation. It's my emphasis. Go to the next slide, please. And then he says, very prophetically, he says, central banks can issue currency, and the parentheses of my comment, create money out of nothing. Forget about that next phrase, non-interest bearing claim on government. That has no meaning. Effectively without limit. And this is Greenspan talking, and he knows. He says the central banks can create money without limit. He says they can discount loans and other assets. The other assets could be rotten tomatoes of banks or other private depository institutions, and now not just depository institutions. Bear Stearns was not a depository institution. It's just another private investment bank, thereby converting potentially illiquid private assets. Well, an illiquid private asset is something that can't be sold, and maybe it can't be sold because it's worthless, into riskless claims. Again, he's talking about money in the form of deposits at the central bank. Come back to me, please. So here you have a guy who was then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he did it 5 times in this talk. He warned people that the central bank stood ready to create money without limit for depository organizations, and again, should they get into trouble. And then we have this quote from the New York Times 10 days ago. Says, this is right now, just last week. He says, but Fed officials told reporters on Sunday night that the new program would have no limit on the amount of money that could be borrowed. Go to the next slide, please. And then we had the Treasury, the Treasury Department of Treasury, Henry Paulson, saying, we'll do whatever it takes. Come back to me, please. Now, when he says it will do whatever it takes, is he talking about whatever it takes in conformity with the Constitution? Is he talking about whatever it takes as long as it doesn't destroy people's savings, people's pensions, people's annuities, people's rents, anything that you have? No, he's talking about doing whatever it takes to save the financial guys. Go to the next slide, please. And here's a key question that you ought to be asking yourselves, that everyone should ask. Why should we have a monetary system that puts everyone at risk? Come back to me, please. And the risk is really your very life. I mean, if you're 25 years old and your savings go away, you can still get more savings. But if you're 85 years old or 75 years old, you are not going to replenish. And so we're saddled with a system which is not in accordance with the Constitution, which is thoroughly dishonest, as I've shown on these programs in prior sessions, where it puts everybody's life at risk and, in fact, puts the whole society at risk. Well, on March 26th, the Financial Times said this. Go to the next slide, please. It says, since financial stability is unattainable, where did that come from? The more important objective is to insulate the real economy from the consequence of financial instability. And go to the next slide, please. And then they followed that up, and they said, we cannot prevent booms and busts in the credit markets. Come back to me, please. Where do they get this business that financial stability is unattainable? Well, it's unattainable if you have bogus money. Sure, it's unattainable because you can create money without limit. How can you have financial stability if you have private parties creating money out of nothing? But why should we have that? Didn't the founders of this country think this issue through? And didn't the Constitution provide for gold and silver as money? And the answer is yes. And those of you who recall the story of Thomas Jefferson, how he was cheated, and in fact he was in debt his entire life because he was cheated with paper money, and at the end he was bankrupt, he couldn't get out. The founders all knew this, as did all of the other gentry from Virginia, including James Madison and George Washington and Thomas Paine. So this is something that was well known at the founding of the country, and it was set up in a way that we should not have had this risk. And what are the consequences of this? Go to the next slide, please. So we're talking about, one slide back, please. One slide back. So we're talking about housing price crashes, which is what you see now. Housing prices, which are supposed to always increase, are now decreasing. You have millions of foreclosures in the horizon. You have people being laid off from their jobs. As these houses go into foreclosure, the neighborhoods get destroyed. You see a collapse in financial profits. And here in New York, that's of particular concern because the local government and even the state government depends on these financial profits in order to, as tax revenues, accounts to something like 20% of tax revenues. You have a loss of interest for savings. I'll talk about that in a moment. And finally, and most important, you have a depreciation of the currency. Come back to me, please. While all this is happening, the guys who are in charge of the monetary structure and their, how shall I say, the press, which they pretty much own or have bought off, they come up with all kinds of spin like they're looking out for you. And one piece of spin, which is particularly egregious, is that they're going to protect the small depositor, and they talk to Federal Deposit Insurance, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, insurance. Come back to me, please. And this supposedly, and again supposedly, guarantees the first $100,000 of money that you have in any bank. This is not to say that the $100,000 that you get back will have any purchasing power, and the notion that this Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was put into practice in order to protect the small depositor is absolutely false. That is an outright lie. And what happened in 1935 after the Great Depression got underway, you recall at the time that Roosevelt was inaugurated, 40% of the, I think 50% of the banks had closed, 50% had failed, 40% had closed, and then he closed the banks. People were very distrustful of banks. And even as late as 1935, people were not putting their money back into banks. Why? Because they didn't trust them, because they had such a bad experience. That's why they passed Federal Deposit Insurance. Not that there were going to be any more bank failures. Every bank that could possibly fail had failed. The idea was to induce people to put their money back into banks. That's what happened. But now, in our age, we have a different set of spin. And all the banks have got together at the Bank for International Settlements, which, by the way, has sovereignty. And they get together, and now they say, we're going to somehow straighten things out. Go to the next slide, please. And they come up with something called the Basel Accords, and maybe you've seen this in the newspaper. And what they want to do is standardize solvency requirements worldwide for banks. Come back to me, please. Now, who's doing the standardizing? Who's doing the writing? It's the bankers themselves. And so initially, our guys came up with, in terms of valuing the assets that they had, they didn't want to market to market. They didn't want to say, what's it trading for? They wanted to use all kinds of formulas, these rocket scientist models that they developed. Well, it turns out that we know now with the subprime crash that all these rocket science models are also bogus. So in other words, in order to establish how much leverage they could take, they wanted to determine and set up the formulas that would be followed worldwide on how to do this. This is another case of the fox running the hen house. So what is the tool that these central banks have in order to somehow stabilize things after a company like Bear Stearns goes puff? And by the way, the real reason for the Federal Reserve coming into, how shall I say, forced the merger of Bear Stearns into J.P. Morgan, this did really not make our press here. The real reason came out in a item in the London press, and I double-checked it. And it turns out that on Bear Stearns' balance sheet, they had 13, and still have, $13 trillion worth of derivative bets. $13 trillion worth of derivative bets. It's in a footnote in the annual report. Well, who's the counterparty for that $13 trillion worth of derivative bets? It's the banks. And so in the event that Bear Stearns went bankrupt, that could pull the plug. In effect, you'd have rolling defaults on the whole $600+ trillion worth of derivative bets. And that was just as of June of last year.